Good afternoon. Welcome to Northpoint of View here in beautiful, historic Savannah, Georgia with Dr. Walter Kemmsies. Walter, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mark. How are you?
I'm good, man. How are you doing?
Great.
Good. Hey, one of the things that we really focus on sort of, in our constant analysis of what's going on is the ports, the volumes. And typically we look at the top 10. Obviously, in the past 12 months, we've been focused on the, west versus east, labor negotiations out west, the growth of the volumes in the east, taking market share. Let's take a minute, let's pause, and we'd love to hear from you on sort of the state of the ports and how you sort of see, sort of where everybody is right now in terms of port growth and momentum.
All right. So we have to lay out facts, and some facts aren't pleasant for certain gateways. But let's just start at the macro level, and we'll drill our way down to the three coasts, and then maybe we pick on a gateway or two.
Okay.
And so at a macro level, the port industry in August of 2020, the top 10 port authorities, and the reason I'm focusing on them and not all of the other smaller ones is that the top 10 port authorities started to handle over 2 million imported TEUs or containers a month.
Yeah.
And except for February of 2021, this went on all the way to August of 2022. So when you add it up, it's 25 consecutive months of peak season import volumes.
Right.
Normally, you only see a couple of months, August, September, July, August, maybe 3 months, but that's it. After that, the volumes drop, and you go clean up the mess that happened during the peak season. Our ports went through 25 consecutive months of peak season, even if the workers weren't getting sick with COVID. With the train drivers, the port employees, the ocean carriers, the stevedores, who are great heroes, but even if they hadn't gotten sick, it still would have been a chaotic mess.
Right.
We're not set up for that. The volume surge at its peak was 20%, and the industry got yelled at for all of the congestion around the ports. Well, let's see. The warehouses got stuffed overnight. We struggled to try to run enough trains to get things from the coast into the inland. We struggled to find truck drivers, and even if it wasn't for COVID, you still wouldn't have had enough truck drivers. So things got stuck at the ports. And if it was 10 years from now and they've been putting capacity in place, that probably wouldn't have been such an issue. So we're now, since August of last year, been seeing year-on-year decline in the volumes, particularly imports. It started at minus 1% in September, minus 5% in October, and all the way until we got to March, where we were down 30% year-on-year. The good news is that last month, April, we were, quote unquote, only down 20%. And you remember from your Wall Street days, like I do, the second derivative, right? So things were going negative as of last August, and they were accelerating in going negative. So that's a negative second derivative. It makes the trend more negative. And in April, the second derivative, the change in the rate of change, went positive. So I pointed that out to a bunch of friends, but they're so shell-shocked by this decline in volumes that they go, it's probably just an aberration. 1 point doesn't make a trend. They're afraid to hope. They're afraid to hope, Mark. And it's the same thing across the ports. There's just this, every day you go to work and you see the volumes down. I've had a friend of mine who told me that she was worried about keeping her job. And I just told her to calm down. She's young, she's needed, and we will stabilize. But right now, that's the big shell shock that the port industry is going through. On the West Coast, the stevedores have agreed on a number of things, but not everything yet, with the PMA. It's the Union of Terminal Operators. But I'm not hearing as many complaints about work stoppage or work slowing down like they were doing about the last 3 to 6 weeks ago, where they called for extra safety checks, which would kill a shift because it took forever. They were red tagging too many chassis. What happens is the inspection for the roadability of a chassis is done by the stevedore union, and they also do the repairs. So if there's not a lot of volume business, you might get suspicious about what's going on. But it looks like that's quieting down, and that we're just down to what's the wage level and what kind of benefits. Now, I got to tell you, the guys in the West Coast, the stevedores have it great. If their back doesn't feel so great, when they get off their shift, they can go to a massage parlor and get a back rub. All right, that's in the contract. There's a health benefit. We're in the wrong profession, Mark. But anyway, so we've progressed to where it looks like some of those bigger issues are being resolved. The East Coast and the Gulf Coast ports recognize that it's not just because the U.S. is pulling away from China, which means you go towards Western Asia mostly, some Mexico. And when that happens, more of the volume goes to the U.S. via the Suez Canal, the Mediterranean, and then over to the East Coast. Not as much to the Gulf Coast, but definitely to the East Coast.
And if you look at, based on the conversation we had just previous, that inventory glut sort of works its way through the system by the end of the third quarter, then you sort of have, I'm asking a question, but into the summer, these volumes and then sort of the port outlook should be sort of on an even keel, maybe even slightly optimistic.
Exactly. And you know what else is cool for the retailers? It's not that easy to find a new source. I've got friends of mine who left Li & Fung when it was bought, and whenever I hear somebody needs help finding a source in Indonesia or India, I ask to introduce it to them, and they help them find a factory somewhere in central India. So, and since the shelves are overstocked right now for those guys, that means they've got a lull to work like hell to restructure their supply chains, so that when things are really back in the swing, they're okay. And it's the same thing we're seeing here in Savannah. We've got so many buildings under construction, so much more procurement than that. And it's all about restructuring your supply chain for a changed world.
Yeah. Before we get there, and maybe that's our next talk, one of the things that you and I have been talking about for a few months, obviously there's a shift from west to east. There's a number of reasons for that. The price of doing business out west, the slip in trade with China, the emergence of the East Coast, but then sort of an underlying theme is the growth of the Gulf ports, right?
Yes, exactly.
And I've been sort of listening to what you say and checking the numbers, but if I'm not mistaken, the Port of Houston has been the fastest growing port percentage-wise of any port in the country.
All the other ports got their butts kicked by Houston.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. And so, and you and I have sort of been looking at Mobile now for a little while. Mm-hmm. And I know that Houston and Mobile have a symbiotic relationship, right? A ship's not going to necessarily go into the Gulf for one stop. And so can you take a minute and just, sort of the sub-theme on the emergence of the East Coast ports versus the West, and how you see the Gulf ports sort of benefiting or sort of coming into their own now?
Right. So going back in time, before 1990, the biggest gateway for container volumes was New York, not LA, Long Beach. That took years for China and Japan and Korea and others to really build up. And it took a lot of investment in infrastructure in the Southern California basin.
And by the way, I think that just a couple of months ago, New York, New Jersey surpassed for the first time in maybe a couple of decades the LA Long Beach volumes.
Yes, they exceeded Long Beach.
Yeah.
For the whole year, they didn't exceed LA, but there were a few months back in 2022 where the port of New York handled more container volumes than either LA or Long Beach.
Yeah.
So, by the way, when Molly...
Back to the Future, right?
No, exactly. Well, Molly Campbell years ago made a statement when she started as the director there, and that within 10 years, New York would exceed Long Beach volumes. And then the press hounded her. They wanted to really talk to her about it. So she called me because we're old friends. I've done a lot of work for her over the years. And she goes, well, can I back my statement up? So I gave her a bunch of facts. And here we are, less than 10 years later, and it happened. So, a lot of this wasn't guesswork. It was math. It's just physical capacity. But the way to look at the East and the Gulf Coast is New York is where all the immigrants came in for years. Even my grandparents, when they came from Latvia, they came in through Ellis Island. Mm-hmm. And so from there, people then propagated into the Midwest. They diffused to the Midwest, to the Northeast a bit, down, the East Coast a little bit. But there's this concentration where 20% of the U.S. population, 20% of U.S. GDP is within 200 miles of the Port of New York. So if you're going to do anything on the East Coast, like bigger ships, you got to make sure New York can handle it.
Right.
Because all the other ports combined just can't serve that sheer massive volume so quickly.
Right.
So now we go to the Gulf Coast. And what's happening is Houston is the main port of entry. And Houston got really big, and people are beginning to, this place is too congested. Let's go to San Antonio. Let's go to Dallas. Let's go to Austin. And these are nice cities that were very well set up. And if you're going to go into the Gulf Coast, you must hit, I think, at least 3 ports. And the 3 ports would be Veracruz, because you can access the Golden Triangle of Mexico. All the manufacturing takes place around Mexico City. And then you would go to Houston and dump off a lot of imported stuff, which Houston can then truck over to the other Texas cities. And then you go to Mobile, where you drop stuff off there's not a lot of people live in the Mobile area. It's about the same population size as Savannah.
Yeah.
But there's great access to that whole section into the southern part of the Midwest. And you can put those containers on a Canadian national line. They have the ICTF there, and it goes straight up to Chicago. And getting from Houston to the Midwest is not as easy as it is to get to the Midwest via Mobile. And so we see that symbiotic relationship that the bigger and better Houston gets. And by the way, they're actually siting their 3rd container terminal.
Yeah.
So that's a 50% expansion for them.
Yeah.
And so you hit there, you hit Mobile, you hit Veracruz, so you get that Mexico flavor, and that's a good service.
So as we sort of wrap up this segment, state of the ports, it's been, the water's been choppy this year. But you see sort of a little bit more of a stabilization going into the end of the year, and fairly optimistic about 24.
Exactly. So this week I gave a talk at the Port of New York, and I chatted with Beth Rooney, the executive director. We're good friends. I was talking to friends of mine at the Virginia Port Authority. They just had their state of the port. We know Jim Newsom. We know what's going on in Charleston. You look at Savannah. You look at Jacksonville. You look at Mobile. You look at Houston. And even New Orleans is siting a new terminal so they can avoid the bridge air draft issue. That part of the U.S. is investing aggressively in capacity.
Yep.
So, it's the 3 C's, like our friend Rick Abelson tells us, the 3 C's: cost, capacity, and consistency. And they are all focused on it. Although New York, this is going to be tough. There's too many people there.
Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah. Well, and again, with the population shift to the southeast, I mean, it's...
Market's coming to us.
Yeah. All we got to do is sit here and wait, right?
Exactly.
Hey, Walter, great being with you.
Yeah, man, good seeing you.
All right, thanks, guys.